Yes, sir.
Do you think Dr. Judy Wood's theory has any credibility whatsoever?
Well, what's presented by Dr. Wood is some phenomena which hasn't been explained, some of which has not been explained. So that's why I gather some attention. What's most interesting about Dr. Wood, who puts forth this evidence and an idea that a free energy device responsible for directed energy, not explosives, not nanothermite, not hot molten metal, all of which she actively, specifically denies in her book on page 120 through 126, denying the evidence of explosions, which you just saw and will hear hundreds of firefighters talking about, and the visual evidence of explosives. Denying the evidence of hot, molten iron, calling it cool for some reason, when the heat of this material has been documented. Denying the evidence of nanothermite and thermite itself, which you saw irrefutable evidence for. So, when someone denies the most scientific, basic forensic evidence, which we do have lots of evidence for, and then promotes a theory which has no evidence, I can only be suspect, in my mind, about the intentions of such people. Thank you.
The great Galileo taught us that experiment is the arbitrator of competing hypotheses. This is perhaps one of the most important statements in scientific history. Experimentation gives us the ultimate truth-finding tool. It is the central thesis of the scientific method. You can apply it to virtually anything. As the modern genius Richard Feynman once said,
"If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong." And that simple statement is the key to science.
In this video, I am putting forth the challenge of experiment to solve the deepening mystery of why 3 massive steel-framed high-rise buildings endured spontaneous symmetric implosions, collapsing to dust at virtual free-fall acceleration. The most commonly held explanation is that plane impacts and jet fuel fires weakened the steel structure, causing the initial failure, which then cascaded out of control to topple the entire building, first one and then the other, and then Building 7 several hours later. There are several problems with this hypothesis, the first being the lack of experimental evidence to suggest that a fire-induced global collapse of a large steel structure is even possible. In 100 years of construction history, no large steel structure has ever collapsed from fire, yet nearly every single steel-framed skyscraper throughout that 100-year history has had a fire at some point during its lifetime. On the other hand, no skyscraper has ever been deliberately struck by a large airliner before either. This seems to complicate the issue until we consider World Trade Center Building 7, which wasn't hit by a plane. We also must consider that the official theory given for the collapse of the Twin Towers was not the airplane crash, but structural weakening of steel due to fire. There is also the issue of repeatability and the manner in which these buildings collapsed. Overall, the burden of proof for the fire-induced collapse hypothesis depends upon repeatability of the experiment, not the prestigious credentials of the people who came up with the theory, not the fallacy of an argument from ignorance which claims that if you can't prove it wrong, it must be right. This theory, just like any other scientific theory, can only be verified by a repeatable experiment. Scientifically, the burden of proof is on the person or group who came up with the theory. Until then, the NIST report is just a 10,000-page guess. As Richard Feynman would say,
it doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
The next hypothesis I'd like to draw attention to is the one that has the most independent scientists, architects, engineers, and physicists supporting it, with a signed petition. This is the explosive controlled demolition hypothesis. Although conventional explosives have been ruled out due to lack of noise and seismic evidence, most independent researchers are focusing on the physical and chemical evidence found in debris samples of World Trade Center dust. Dr. Stephen Jones was the first to discover iron-rich microspheres in samples of World Trade Center dust. Further investigation into the source of these microspheres, bilayered red chips of iron oxide and aluminum, the two main ingredients in an incendiary compound known as thermite, or nanothermite. Thermite burns so incredibly hot that it can melt straight through the engine block of a car. When thermite reacts, it produces aluminum oxide and molten hot steel. It is conventionally used for welding and melting iron and steel. In its November 1935 issue, Popular Mechanics explained how the 3 million-pound steel Skyride Tower in Chicago was demolished using thermite to melt through its 10-foot steel leg sections. So this seems to be a scientifically legitimate hypothesis. We have a chain of evidence from the crime scene leading directly to nanothermites. We have scientifically verifiable experiments providing that you can demolish steel structures using thermites. And we even have a host of shady suspects who worked inside the World Trade Center buildings with a series of suspicious connections to companies which produce nanothermite, including patents on nanothermite demolition devices. Now, another hypothesis has emerged on the scene and has been making waves, so to speak. This theory has now gained enough attention and seemingly popularity that I felt I needed to make a video addressing it. After multiple appearances on Coast to Coast AM and other radio programs, Dr. Judy Wood's proposal that a wave-based interference mechanism related to the Hutchison effect may have been used to demolish the buildings. Now, the biggest problem I run into when I try to talk to physicists or anyone else about the Hutchison effect is the issue of experimental reproducibility. It definitely seems intuitively possible to produce these types of effects using some sort of molecular or electromagnetic interference. And with Dr. Wood's PhD background and area of expertise in material science and interferometry, I'd like to see some experiments performed and papers published on this in order to give it more scientific credibility. All I've seen from Dr. Wood so far is a colorful picture book which continuously stresses the need to look at evidence in order to determine exactly what happened at the World Trade Center. I will agree that we have to look at evidence, but oftentimes two different people can look at the same piece of evidence and draw very different conclusions. Also, evidence is not proof. Proof is simply how much evidence is needed in order to prove something to a specific individual. For some people, all the evidence in the world isn't proof, debunkers, for example, and for others, the tiniest piece of circumstantial evidence works as proof. So we have to be careful. Take, for instance, the microscopic fragments of aluminum and iron oxide, which nanochemists and other experts have determined to be nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust. Now, in her book and on her website and on Coast to Coast AM several times, I've heard Dr. Wood repeat the claim that these nanoparticulates of aluminum and iron oxide were actually byproducts of the Hutchison effect, which turned the buildings into dust, thus producing nanoparticulates of building materials which just appear to look like nanothermite. She also claims that the nanothermite evidence is just a distraction from the real truth about the Hutchison effect and the use of free energy technology on 9/11. But like any good skeptical scientific researcher, we must also consider the opposite possibility, and most importantly, demand proof for such claims. Until I see some experiments or peer-reviewed scientific papers which can take structural steel, separate out the manganese and carbon from the alloy, and rapidly oxidate the leftover iron, and solidify it into a grid-like matrix which resembles the nanothermite particles found in the World Trade Center dust, then I will continue to remain skeptical that such an effect is even possible. Kevin Ryan has videos of chemistry experiments he conducted where he produces nanothermite. In his experiments, he requires the use of an organic compound which forms a matrix in order for the iron oxide and aluminum to adhere to. Again, I'm not sure how such a feat could be accomplished in midair using lasers. One thing I am sure of is that lasers can be used to ignite nanothermite. In fact, SAIC, the company who developed this laser ignition technology, also helped to destroy the evidence from Ground Zero and helped to author the NIST report. So all in all, I've given you my scientific overview of the three competing hypotheses. On the surface, we have the official government-sponsored guess that fire was the only available mechanism, and therefore fire must have brought down all three skyscrapers on 9/11. Even though it is well known that fire has never caused the complete catastrophic failure of a steel skyscraper, and terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda often use explosives in their attacks, the government investigation into 9/11 never thought to test for the presence of explosives. Despite that this is standard protocol for normal fire investigations to test for explosives or accelerants, the government never tested for them and instead illegally destroyed all the evidence, or so they thought. Another group of researchers examined dust samples left over from Ground Zero and discovered a chain of evidence leading them to an alternate hypothesis for why the buildings collapsed on 9/11. That a high-tech explosive incendiary known as nanothermite was used to bring about the deceptive demolition of World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7. Deceptive because nanothermite doesn't create the loud bangs or bright flashes of conventional demolition explosives, and its constituents and byproducts appear similar to normal building materials. And lastly, we have the hypothesis championed by Dr. Judy Wood, a violent opponent of the nanothermite evidence, who instead insists that the towers were vaporized to dust by an undocumented, unproven effect which has never been reproduced in a laboratory and has no scientific credibility to substantiate it. In addition to the difficulty in elaborating on how such an effect could have been produced, is the issue of how it was deployed. One of Dr. Wood's hypotheses is a space-based weapon powered by free energy, another undocumented and unproven phenomenon. Given the time windows separating each of the destruction events at the World Trade Center, these couldn't have come from a single satellite-based weapon in regular orbit, so either there's two of these massive satellites orbiting Earth, or they had one in geostationary orbit over the equator firing a beam down at a steep angle over lower Manhattan. There's also the issue of timing and precision. Look at any video of the buildings collapsing and ask yourself what would be required to reproduce these events exactly as they happened. Several thousand major structural components would need to be severed in exactly the right manner within fractions of a second of one another. Even if the Hutchison effect was a proven technology, which I don't deny and it still could turn out to be, then how is it deployed with such precision and timing? Why did people report explosions in the buildings before the planes hit? I've heard Judy Wood try to explain away all the multiple reports of explosions with her Hutchison effect hypothesis, using the example of an egg in a microwave exploding without the use of explosives. But if the Hutchison effect was active before the first plane even hit, then how can it also explain the precision with which the towers came down? All of this seems to me as a way to overcomplicate what really happened on 9/11 and distract and confuse anyone trying to unravel the mystery. Judy Wood has attacked all the evidence pointing to nanothermite and attempted to explain it all away in terms of some exotic effect which has never been experimentally reproduced or scientifically verified. Many of the pictures used in her book and on her website indicate irregular heating, burning, and warping of various materials, which she then posits could only have been produced by an exotic and unproven mechanism. I would suggest that many of these characteristics are consistent with pyroclastic flow damage seen in volcanic eruptions, and could have just as easily been produced by superheated exploded steel and concrete using nanothermite. Take this picture for instance. The car is only burned on the top half. If you think about a cloud of superheated gas expanding and rolling outwards from the collapsing buildings, the gas inside the middle of the pyroclastic flow will be the hottest, but will cool down considerably on the surface of the cloud, where it is expanding and coming into contact with surrounding cooler air. As the cloud rolls outward over cars like this one, the superheated gas at the center will be hot enough to melt the paint, while the cooler periphery of the cloud as it rolls across the ground will leave the lower half of the car at a much lower temperature than the superheated gas near the middle of the cloud. So you see there are alternative explanations for all of the material characteristics of debris seen in Dr. Wood's extensive photo collections, which thankfully don't involve wacky analogies to food and kitchen items. In one instance, Dr. Wood compares the molten metal dripping from the South Tower shortly before it collapses to the orange color of Cheetos snack food. I don't know about you, but to me it looks an awful lot like thermite. Of course, that doesn't mean it is thermite, just that there isn't any other convincing alternative explanation which is backed by a verifiable experiment. I'm sure we could continue this debate for hours, so I'd like to hear your thoughts. I've heard some people tell me they think Judy Wood is a disinfo agent, injecting the movement with bogus theories in an attempt to undermine and ridicule the more serious scientific groups like AE 9/11 Truth. I've also heard that she is part of a psyop, trying to discredit the nanothermite evidence and engage people in an endless debate over what happened on 9/11 in order to prevent them from looking at who was behind it. People have drawn attention to the fact that she hasn't yet lost her university position like other scientists and researchers who have spoken out openly about 9/11. I've heard a lot of different things.
The evidence of explosions, which you just saw and will hear hundreds of firefighters talking about, and the visual evidence of explosives. Denying the evidence of hot, molten iron, not nanothermite, not hot, molten metal, all of which she actively, specifically denies in her book on page 120 through 126, denying some of which has not been explained. So that's why it gathers some attention. What's most interesting about Dr. Wood, who puts forth this evidence and an idea that a free energy device responsible for directed energy, not explosives, calling it cool for some reason, when the heat of this material has been documented. Denying the evidence of nanothermite and thermite itself, which you saw irrefutable evidence for. So, when someone... Yes, sir?
Do you think Dr. Judy Wood's theory has any credibility whatsoever?
Well, what's presented by Dr. Wood is some phenomena which hasn't been explained.